to our first speaker presentation of the year. We have the pleasure tonight of having Mr. Nathan Bastos from Own Energy, and he came from San Antonio, Texas. He is a former Aggie and proud of it. He's very excited to be here tonight and for the football game tomorrow. Apparently he's a die-hard football fan and attends most, if not all, of the home games. So anyway, let's give a round of applause for him.
Howdy!
Howdy!
You'll get excited one day to say that. So this is meant to be interactive. I'll cover some basic things, but it's not meant to be something where I read off the slide. I'm not an engineer, so I might be intimidated by your question, but I'm very honest, so if I don't know, I'll just say I don't know, because I might not know the answer to your question.
There's a way to do this. I know there is.
Just flip it.
There you go.
It's these lights, yeah.
Yeah.
So
That's it.
either way.
Well, but no, there's a.
Oh, there you go.
Ah!
That's it. You got it.
Nice.
So, as Nicole said, I'm class 98. I was in the Corps Cadets here and graduated in 4.5 years. I started out in civil engineering. My dad was a double E, but I didn't stick with it. I didn't really focus on school very much. And so I was fortunate enough, through the grace of God, to get accepted to graduate school despite my GPA here in the business program, and graduated with my MBA in 2005. So since then, right after business school, I worked in real estate finance, structuring commercial real estate transactions, and leveraged that to eventually get into the wind and solar business. So it's meant to be a practical, hands-on thing. So again, feel free to kind of raise your hand and ask questions. No questions off the table about me or work or just real simplistic questions. I think at a high level, we'll kind of jump right in. So anyway, so these are the things we'll go over. I thought it was important to craft the context for what we're talking about. So the state of the markets, and then more the idea of where we're going and why it might be relevant to you is how do wind and solar, particularly utility scale, which are really power plants, how does it relate to you? And then maybe my degree, and how do these three things of engineering, economics, and policy come together to impact the build out and development of these projects. And then often a common question is a misnomer of renewable energy is always more expensive, or someone's only doing it for a public relations benefit. And the reality there is, I'm not a tree hugger. I grew up in South Texas. I went to A&M twice. It's a pretty conservative place, most people would say. And at the end of the day, there is an economic argument, a real economic argument for that it does make sense, and something most people should be aware of. And then a little bit just about our company, so you have a background, why I do this for a living, why I get a kick out of it. So state of the markets. So what defines a stable market? This is my opinion. It may not be right. It's also probably some plagiarization from a few things I've found in Google searches. But at the end of the day, stable policy is an important thing. And policy is, many things are driven by incentives. And so whether it's tax incentives, whether it's oil and gas allowing certain partnerships, but at the end of the day, you need some predictability so that when you're planning, when you as engineering students get out there and you're working on your first project and you're designing it, it's not likely that it's going to get done in 1 year's time. It may take several years. And as a result, you need stable, predictable policy to guide and make sure that what you're planning for can be implemented at some point in the future. Furthermore, you need access to capital. If you haven't realized it yet, you soon will, regardless of how great your idea is, regardless how perfectly you engineer something, unless you can get the bankers to buy off on it and agree to get them to give you capital, it's really just a great idea that will never go anywhere, because that's where business comes into this. You need to have a supporting market infrastructure, and what I mean by that is you need to have players, proven reputable players that want to participate in the market. And lastly, you need to have something very simple, but that's demand for your product, right? Yes, sir.
Okay, first question.
Sure.
You touched on stable policy.
Uh-huh.
There are PTCs particularly for wind.
Right.
And I've heard different arguments, and I want to hear your point of view. because you had also talked about favorable partnerships in oil and gas, essentially, or is a stable policy that I'm guessing helped that industry. Is there something similar to a PTC in other energy sectors, maybe oil and gas and those type of things, or is it something different but for the same reason?
I don't know if it's a true apples to apples comparison. I'll dig into the policy section in a bit, and I'll address it there. Is that okay?
Yes.
But make sure you bring it up. I don't want to dodge your question.
Oh, I won't forget it.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Can you define PTC for us?
Oh, yeah, production tax credit.
That's correct.
So there's different energy sources have different subsidies to help them along the way, either in the front end or the middle end or the end user in those energy sources. So depending on how the legislation got written or what was focused on, there's subsidies to help out that industry. I just want to see what the difference is between the energies, different energy sources in their structures. So yeah, production tax credit is every time something is produced, you get a tax credit for that. So it's not an actual subsidy, you just get a credit for it.
Right.
Which helps out to access the capital.
Yeah, so an example of that locally, it's not a production tax credit, but it is a tax credit, is if you drive down Welborn Road towards Bryan from campus, there's a bunch of new apartments there. There's, I think it's Z Islander, Reveille Ranch, and then there's a smaller one, I think it's called Saddlewood. It's been there since, I don't know, at least since 2005. And that one is a tax credit apartment complex. You have certain income requirements you have to fit in. You can't be, you have to be employed, but not, there are certain things in there. But the idea is that it's funded and financed through tax credits. And similarly, many types of, not just energy, but other sources have financing that's supported by tax credits. So it's a very important question, actually. So any other questions? So anyways, this is, in my opinion, what defines a stable market. At the end of the day, if you go into the world, probably the most important one is demand and stable policy out of all these. So stable policy, to that end. At the end of the day, this is an example of when you have unstable or a lack of a stable market. And this is basically the boom-bust cycle of the wind business specifically. And so this is the build-out. The source is the American Wind Energy Association. This is wind capacity. Wind projects are rated like an energy project in megawatts. And at the end of the day, when we had stable policy, when the production tax credit was in place for 1 to 2 years, being these are power plants and you have to plan for them years in advance. When you had policy, you had a boom. Well then, developers like ourselves were worried, is this policy going to be there long term? So in the run up to the expiration of that policy, you had a large build out of wind, and even though it takes several years to build, when that policy expired, because even though it had been renewed here, for that short period of time when it expired, that whole pipeline did not get a chance to get built out. So once it got renewed, then you had to immediately run up again, and then so there was this big boom, and then it expired. And so what you see here is an up, down, this boom-bust cycle, and then finally around 2004, 2005, there was some degree of stable policy. When I say stable, it was a longer than a 2-year extension that Congress passed that said, fine, we're going to see if we can support this industry. Well, there are other things that attributed to why these numbers accelerated at this pace, but at the end of the day, a huge contributing factor there is the fact that there was stable policy, there was predictability. So if I'm an investor, whether I'm a bank or I'm an engineer and I'm a consultant, I'm going to go out and build a business around this entire industry, or I have an engineering firm and I want to maybe branch into renewable energy. There's a cost for all of that, right? You've got to hire students, or you've got to acquire that knowledge. And you hope to get a return, again, the business side, get a return on your money. Well, you want to know that if you're going to make this investment of time and capital, that there's going to be a return. And so what you saw here is that a lot of people were making decisions across the board to support that, and all of those things kind of compounded. Natural gas prices went way up back in through here, and so you saw the build out of that when there was much more demand for product. And so that's one thing of why stable policy is so important. You can see it in this chart. But to your question, so is there an equivalent? Your question was, what are the similar types of tax credits. Is that right?
Tax credits, subsidies, whatever.
Yeah, well, I would generally call them incentives, because a government that doesn't have a way to, how you and I might incentivize each other is pay someone to do something, right? Or buy them off with some food to come to a presentation. Especially if you're a poor college student, pizza usually works real well. And so people do what they're incentivized to do. And so a government doesn't really have a way of mandating things except through their tax policy, original policy. And so governments, as a way of incentivizing it, and Texas is a good example, despite being quite conservative, is we incentivized through our tax policy the idea of production tax credits. So to your point, as the energy is produced, you get a tax credit that you can then sell to someone that has to pay taxes. So basically someone can come, I'm Mr. Wind Farm, I'm spinning on producing credits, and I'm a business over here, and Mr. Business says, well, I have a lot of profit, I don't want to pay taxes on this. So I'm going to invest in this wind farm, and I won't necessarily avoid paying taxes, but as opposed to just giving the government all my money, I'll make it an investment over here that will give me a rate of return on those taxes. So as opposed to you're not necessarily fully dodging the taxes, you're just getting a return on the taxes that you would pay. And so this is, in my opinion, whether it doesn't have to be renewable energy, but a responsible way to encourage reinvestment of tax dollars versus the government allocating it directly or handing it out. It's a way of encouraging business to reinvest through tax credits, much like these houses down here, which serve a very good need. Yes, sir?
Couldn't you stabilize the market by getting rid of the tax credits? I mean, because in essence, you'd be adding competition to everything. Because there are some people that are coming out saying, well, there's a tax credit, so I can produce wind or solar at a particular cost, and you're going to have other folks that say, well, that's a good business thing. I'll jump on that and get in on the market. Mm-hmm. And when really they're just taking away competition because they may not be able to produce as well as the next company, so they're taking away the business of someone that can make it.
The short answer is, in a vacuum and in a classroom or in a efficient market, so think of stocks where you have a lot of buyers and a lot of traders, the short answer is absolutely yes. But we don't operate, the world doesn't operate in an efficient market theory. It's a theoretical landscape. It's not realistic. And the reality is that power is not traded. There's only two areas of the country, ERCOT and PJM, the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland market, where power is, where there's an efficient theory concept. Ironically enough, where there is some degree of open competition, even though there has been subsidy, is where there's been the most amount of build-out of wind. So ERCOT, where Texas is, there's a huge, not all of Texas, but a good portion of it, there's a huge build-out of wind. So the subsidy enhanced the efficient market theory that I'm describing. But to your point, most industries have some degree of subsidy. So as an example, oil and gas companies, pipeline companies are allowed to use these things called MLPs, Master Limited Partnerships, which it allows them to avoid paying taxes. That's not eligible for certain renewable energy resources. So it's very hard to make, first of all, a generalized statement because everybody's got an agenda for it. But at the end of the day, it's very hard to also compare oil and gas to wind and solar, because wind and solar are much more like power plants, whereas oil and gas is a commodity that you can easily transport. It's not nearly as easy to transport power unless you have a transmission line. And so it's just very hard to make a true apples-to-apples comparison and say this tax incentive, or we shouldn't subsidize this, or we should subsidize that, because there's an entire, as an example of oil and gas, there's an entire supportive infrastructure that exists quite well through competition. And so you could say, maybe we should pull off the MLP status associated with oil and gas companies, and maybe that would be apples to apples. Well, I firmly believe we need it all. We don't need one or the other. And I'm not up here trying to say that wind or solar can save the world, or that we need to, it and alone can power the electrical grid. That's just not true. But there's a place for all. And we'll move on in a second, but at a most basic element, does anybody remember the employees of Enron? Remember Enron, the huge company that crashed? And all those employees, they didn't have to, but many of them took stock options, or they bought their own stock in their own company, right? And so that is most people say that's a lack of diversification, right? They bought only Enron stock. Enron's only going up. People did this recently in the housing market. They only bought the house, and I'm not going to make any money, I can make more money in the house. And they didn't diversify. Well, in economic terms, if you take economics classes, there is a cost for that.